Hey guys, Propel. Please drink this. It's great. Alright. Now that I wasted the first 20 seconds of my review doing product placements, I'm going to get to the meat of this review's matter. Now, since I did a. Oh man. Since I posted my cover for the week for today yesterday, I'm doing two reviews this week, and the first one of which I'm doing will be my review of the critically hated Rocky 5. And before you decide to go off and watch a different YouTube video, I highly suggest you sit here and listen because oftentimes I find with movies that people say are terrible, a good chunk of the time they're right. The movie is terrible, but other times it's overreaction. Um, I'm not gonna sit here. I'm not gonna sit here and say that Rocky Five is actually a good movie and people don't realize it. I'm pretty sure there's someone out there that could make that argument, but the person who can make that argument is not the person talking on this video. So personally, when I think of Rocky Five, I think of like the worst possible way you could end a Rocky series compared to the other movies. Because the whole essence of the Rocky series is basically about having some stiff competition and some hard obstacles to overcome. And then, no matter what hardships are holding you below here, you manage to knock them out of the way and rise above your problems. In this movie, considering the fact that they were hyping this movie up as the last Rocky movie, I think the fact that the film didn't end with Rocky in a climactic boxing match that he would win, literally or figuratively, I think the fact that that was not the climax of the movie and instead it just ended in a street brawl, I think that really angered a lot of fans. And I understand the point that they were going with, that Rocky is trying to fight Tommy on his own terms without the cartoon character villain getting any money out of the fight. I understand that as the point, and I understand that Rocky was trying to prove a point, but I feel like there's a good idea there that they're trying to get across that Tommy doesn't really have what it takes to fight a real contender. But I feel like if you wanted to have that be the punchline for Tommy's story arc, I would have had it where Rocky and Tommy do agree to a boxing match. Tommy sees how much of a bully his promote that George Washington Duke is, so he kicks George Washington out of his life, gets another promoter slash trainer, and would fight Rocky in a fair fight that ends with Rocky barely beating him at the last second. Much like how Rocky barely beat Apollo in the second movie. Only if I was doing it, I wouldn't have Tommy get knocked out with Rocky falling to the mat with him. I would have it where Rocky knocks out Tommy with just 10 seconds left in the final round. So Tommy basically loses in the last 10 seconds because of one brutal hit that just knocked him out of his world. I think that would have worked. And then I would have had it where Tommy and Rocky get carried out of the ring by their fans and everyone goes into the sunset happy. And Tommy realizes that he may not be a heavyweight champ, but he's still a well regarded fighter because he fought a very, very skillful boxer and gave that guy one hell of a run for his money. That would have worked. And there are a lot of problems with this movie. It's not just the fact that the climax is anticlimactic for a Rocky movie. It's the fact that the movie is trying hard to recreate the aesthetic and the tones of the first movie of being this kind of gritty from the streets kind of movie where it's Rocky going back to his roots. And they even went so far to try and make that happen by getting John G. Avildsen back to direct Rocky Five. And at this point, Avildsen really had not really had that many successes prior to Rocky Five. Like, I mean, like he had after the Rocky movies, he did direct a few other movies that were hits, but his career was starting to fall apart. And I think the last movie he did before Rocky Five was the very much hated Karate Kid Part Three. That movie I can see where it gets the hate from, because that movie. Let me digress. The reason why Karate Kid Part Three is a hell of a lot worse than Rocky Five. Rocky Five is at least continuing the story from the previous entries. Karate Kid is just doing the first movie all over again, except we've seen it before and there's not much passion with it. And Machio in that movie is even more incompetent at fighting than the first movie. I haven't seen Karate Kid Part 3 all the way through, but I've seen reviews, clips. I've basically seen the movie through other people's interpretations of Karate Kid 3. Back to Rocky 5. But yeah, so you're trying to go for a gritty, realistic tone. My problem with that is that the antagonist that Rocky has to contend with isn't even another boxer, but it's this boxing promoter, George Washington Duke Evers, I believe his name is. Actually, no, it's George Washington Duke, actually. So George Washington Duke is constantly goading and harassing Rocky into partaking in a fight, which Rocky can't do because he has brain damage, which is a point another reviewer brought up that I'll talk about in a second. But if you're trying to make this movie gritty and realistic, you can't have this cartoon character money grabbing jerk and expect us to buy this as the real world. I mean, even some of the idiots we have nowadays are they're blatant, but they're not so cartoon. Well, honestly, with the way things are nowadays, a lot of things are cartoonishly over the top. So maybe that character in Rocky Five is ahead of his time, but for the sake of the movie, he just sticks out like a sore thumb because it's like this guy is just a one note character. You could make him. You could still make George Washington Duke in this movie a money grabbing jerk. You could still leave that in there. That's fine. But you need to do it in a way where it's blatant, but not cartoonishly blatant. You know. But that's another problem. Um, yeah, and Rocky's injury, if you look at Decker Shadow's review on YouTube, he did say when he did research on the review, the injury that Rocky was suffering from was really nothing more than a severe concussion. So he would have been able. I mean, he would have been able to box right away, but he would have been able to, box after the symptoms had died down a little bit, and done some, you know, treatment. And the fall from grace that Rocky goes through, again, Decker Shadow brought up that realistically that wouldn't have happened because the way they set up the the way they set up the means of Rocky ending up being flat broke, I think if they had tried, I think if they did it where they find out about the problem and then they slowly lose their fortune and then the story picks up 5 years later, which that would make it more understandable why Stallone's kid is 14, even though the year is supposed to be 1985. But yeah, at any rate, there is still yeah. So the movie's trying hard to be realistic, but there's a lot of elements in there that clearly wouldn't fit a gritty, realistic movie, and And the reason why I think this movie is everything a Rocky movie shouldn't be an anticlimactic is that, you know, well, I already explained it, but I I, I just feel like that if they really wanted to make this movie work, they would have had to make the situation more believable, and I think they also would have had to make Rocky fight Tommy and have Tommy sort of learn his lesson and then they make amends at the end. I think that would have been a good way to do the movie. But what we ended up getting is that they're actually what we ended up getting was kind of a movie. It was a movie that had some potential, but it was just lazily executed. And Sylvester Stallone himself even admitted he made this movie clearly completely out of greed, so that probably hurt a lot. Um, but there are a few things in this movie that are actually worth praising. The relationship between Rocky and his kid, it's set up it's set up in a way where it is believable. And Sage Stallone, I don't think he really did any acting before this movie, but he actually did a very good job at playing this rich kid who kind of has to learn to live on the streets. But that does lead to another problem in the movies where Rocky is trying to explain to his kid how to avoid getting mugged or how to avoid getting conned or scammed or abused on the street. And the problem with that scene is I don't have any problem with you teaching your kids stuff to be aware of because you have to be aware of that in the neighborhood they're in at this point. But he just tells them what to look out for. He doesn't know what he's Rocky's telling his kid, okay, watch out for this, watch out for that, but he doesn't tell him how to avoid it. It's like it's like telling someone to it's like telling someone a word. It's like saying, "Oh, this is gargantuan," or "This is supercilious." It's like you're saying the words and you're expecting the person to automatically know what the definition is. The, your kid's been living in a life of luxury. He's not going to understand cons and scams unless you A, bring it up to him, B, explain what they are, and 3, explain how to avoid them. So Rocky did a pretty crappy job at keeping his kids safe. Um, and we see that obviously because Rocky's kid Robert gets pummeled repeatedly throughout the movie until he pummels the bullies himself. And I do think Tommy, the idea of Rocky being a coach and coaching or being a manager and coaching this young talent who's a lot of potential, just not a lot of discipline. I think that's a good storyline, but again, Tommy not realizing he's being used by George Washington Duke. It would have been nice if he'd realized that, but that just leads to the street fight. And the street fight, even though it's not exactly what you would look for in a Rocky film, it is kind of fun to see the different angles and the different fight moves. And it kind of calls back to the fact that even though Rocky had a lot of success in his life, he was still a guy from the streets. So it still kind of did a callback to that. I just think that if they'd settled their differences in a boxing match with Rocky winning, George Washington Duke getting kicked out, and all that stuff, I think it would have worked better. But all in all, if you've been avoiding this movie because you're hearing people say it's awful, with any movie that people complain about, I would check out the movie first. I would either watch the movie or see someone else talk about it while showing clips of the movie, or you can just find clips of the movie online and decide for yourself. But you really shouldn't let people determine for you whether you should like a movie or not. I didn't like it. I thought it was a Rocky movie that had a lot of potential that just got, kicked out of the stadium. But I do think that this movie is not awful. Disappointing. It's it's bad when you compare it to the other Rocky movies, but in general, there's a lot of worse films out there, sequels included. So that's my review. And this weekend, I'll be reviewing a certain superhero movie that has a lot of you guys on the internet ready to crucify the creators of said movie and people who defend it.